We may among other things learn from it this leifon, that we ought not to be forward as many men other wife of great parts are wont to be, in preferring narrow limits to the power of nature and art, and in condemning and riding all thophe that pretend to or believe uncommon things in chemistry, as either cheats or credulous. Boyle registered trademark. Introduction. Fre. Co and perufal of ancient chemical writers, and an early attachment to the metallurgic branches of chemistry incline the author of the enfuing narrative to believe that the wonders related in books that prevent little read, though frequently exaggerated, had at least foam foundation. The phenomena which he continually met with in the pursuit of his experimental inquiries contributed greatly to strengthen this opinion. He found also that foam discoveries fuppuff to be modern were really recorded in very ancient writers, but in terms faux obscure, that the faft must rather be applied to explain the description than the descriptioi to illustrate the faft. The portions of the if Spagyric philosophers repeating metals seemed to be very easily reconciled with the noti ons of more modern chemists, that their inflammable principle in modern language, or their sulfur in that of the ancients, is the fame in all, is now universally allowed, that, too. Introduction. That the imperfect metals had a phaline principle, the antient chemists knew or believed, and according to Boerhaave denoted it by a crofts attached to their characters, as in 24H and the like, the moft excellent of modern chemists, Professor Bergman of Upfall, from the experiment of the acute Schiele, who has demonstrated an actual acid in arsenic, fufpexan acid, at least a phaline baphus to be common to all the imperfect metallic substances of their earths, moft have allowed the diversity, but specific gravity being usually considered as the least dubious mark of real identity between two bodies otherwise dissimilar, it seemed probable that mercury and gold had a baphus nearly alike. The remarkable analogies between the habitudes of silver and mercury to chemical solvents and other agents are known to every chemist. Thefe, and 1,000 other analogies, too obvious as well as too minute to relate, occurred in a course of incessant experiment, in which an ardent curiosity involved the author at a very early period, and which, in consequence of his being partly engaged in instructing others, and from various coughs, not material to the public, he had occasion to compare with passages in books containing all future reading, as was never read. Among this mass of unformed matter, where opinion fought with opinion, and chaos judged the strife, the fishes glitter of foam-broken gems allured him to prosecute his search, and if possible dive to the bottom. The turbid stream did not permit. Introduction. 3. Permit his view of its utmost depths, but he returns to few that he has been below the surface, and not quite in vain. To the chemist it is unnecessary to hint at more Anna. Lois, to others it would be Uphilefs, Alufians to chemi. Calfax to the latter would be unintelligible. It mult there, for be only to the philosophers by fire why, that he can address the former part of this introduction, for who can teach of science in a page? Of facts, however, all men of common fenfe are equally judges. Having, therefore, partly affianed his refunds for instituting the inquiry, he now proceeds to the adaflation of its refault. Exclude 5 of the confirmation which this will receive from reflecting on the difficulty of deceiving men, even of common sagacity, as to a fact which baffled before their own eyes, the testimony at prefent offered, Boflefles pecu, liar advantages. The characters of many spectators of the Fe Procefs, woofy titles adorn the following pages, are too well known in the political or literary world to require in this place any illustration. Among the remainder, foam, members of a society, woof object is to investigate truth by experiment, were too perficacious to let error escape undetected. And a too sacred introduction, sacred funflying of others, must have impelled them to market, if voluntary, with public reprobation. In his fur FT experiment, indeed, the author had only time to request the preference of Captain Groff, a gentleman advantageously known to the antiquarian world by his researches and publications, that of the Reverend Mr. Anderfon, a clergyman residing near Guildford, well versed in expe, rhymental philosophy, and studious of its chemical bran. Ches, and of Mr. Roof, tell a magistrate of the place and a perfon from his technical employments conversant with the appearance of the precious metals, well acquainted with the usual operations on them, and with the methods employed by artists for ascertaining their commercial value. As the first process was quickly mentioned, more spectators were present at the later ones, and the fevent was made before a company foe reputable, as to leave the AU. Thor little to wifty, for in point of testimony. The experiments, however, which it is the purpose of the following narration to relate, are of a nature foe very uncommon, and tend to establish an opinion foe generally exploded. that to procure them credit requires the MO50 refbettable attestation. The place in which the experiments were made, being at a considerable distance from the capital, would not add MIT of their being feigned by many to whom the author would otherwise have been happy in exhibiting them. The whole of the materials producing the extraordinary change in the metal employed was expended in perform. In the process which are now to be related, nor can the author furnish himself with a second portion, but by a process equally tedious and operative, waf effects he has recently experienced to be injurious to his health, and of which he mud therefore avoid the repetition. The repetition indeed would avail but little to establish the fads, or gain belief. That more would believe if more had been prevent is indeed true, but as the spectators of a fad muft always be less numerous than Tuffy who hear it related, the majority muft at last believe, if they believe at all, on the credit of attestation. Previous to this publication, the author has had frequent opportunities of hearing the opinions of many concerning its subject. Some say that they cannot account for the theory of the process, and therefore that the fad is not true. Others AFK, if it be true, is it profitable? Illiberal minds forgift that the whole was a trick, and without knowing or inquiring what evidence it rests on, modestly call the author a knave and the spectators fools. And foam heroes of incredulity declare that they would not believe it though they law it with their own eyes and touched it with their own hands. To prejudice, avarice, or illiberality, perhaps no answer will prove satisfactory, but of the candid and impartial he ventures to AFK, by what arts of deceit Mercury can be prevented from boiling in a red heat, as in Exper, Zweite, or when actually boiling and evaporating, it could be almoft inflantanufli, fixed by addition of a fuvtance not above I. 480th, of its weight as in Exper. Third, metal might, though not easily before 12 or 14 spectators, have been secretly conveyed into the crucible. But this will not account for the event of Exper, Viert. And fifth, where the silver was enriched with a quantity of gold 8 times larger than the weight of powder projected, and yet the absolute gravity of the mixed mass remained the same, or rather smaller, than the original weight, which could not have happened had any undue addition been made. He may further, although this is not properly an argument with the public at large, but only with Tofu know his situation, what could induce him to take future laborious and indirect methods of acquiring finifter fame, powerful as he was of total independence and of chemical reputation. The author is too well aware of the strength of preju. Dice to be at all sanguine in his expectations of receiving credit, but the curiosity of the public has been a foe, much excited, and his character foe rigorously examined, that in justice to himself and compliance with them, he offers the following succinct account of his experiments. An AC, count which was read over to the respective witnesses of each experiment, and of which he now publicly, as B, for privately, requests their confirmation, without the flighted fear of contradiction or defiant. He has endeavored to give every possible function to his introduction. Seventh, his percelts, by subjecting them to the minute impedlian and cautious examination of the spectators, waf rank and discernment confer as much honor on him as is reflected on themselves by their liberality and candor. Whatever may be the opinion of the public, it is previously necessary that they would have the facts laid before them. And though he would be more happy to meet with belief, he halt not be surprised if he fails of obi, taining it, with confidence therefore in his own integrity and relay. Ants on their candor he waits their decision, not void of felicitude, but without trepidation, the more confirmed by the recent honors with which the university to whom he owes his education have crowned his chemical labors. Her favors he thus publicly mentions, from a better motive he hopes than vanity. By them his scientific and moral character is placed beyond the limits, at lead of vulgar scrutiny. And he must ever remember with respectful gratitude that lie enlarged her institutions to place him among her graduates at the influence of her medical professors and with approbation of the academic senate. Abstract. O.F. Boyle's historical account. O.F.A. Degradation of gold. A.S. Every fad becomes more probable in proportion. To the number of similar instances, it may not be improper to prefix to the following relation a concise AC account of the celebrated experiment of Boyle on gold. It would have been easy to called, from books particu, largely from the notes on Boerhaave's chemistry, under the articles History of Chemistry, and metals, many nara. Types of changes of metallic bodies specifically similar to that of our principle. Fabjed, i.e., of not only a change but amelioration. Boyle's experiment resembles ours, generically only, for it was a change, but not amelioration, yet its consequence being to debate for the metal it goes to. Wards the proof of a metallic transmutation. Boerhaave's work is in almost everyone's hand. Quotation therefore from it would be superfluous. The works B of Boyle are now left frequently read, and his historical account, which to Uffe's own words, is really a jail-range chemical narrative was so much in point. That an abridgment appears in this place without impropriety, an abridgment rather than a transcription was attempted, since from the quaintness of Boyle's style, his own narrative would perhaps make no favorable impreflion on the ears of modern readers. It much resembles the massive furniture of other days, made cumbrous by its own ornaments. Yet perhaps many would more willingly have perused the relation in its original form, as we view with pleasure the softened day, through storied windows richly dight, calling a dim religious light. For the gratification of Fouche are referred some fragments of this work of the venerable father of English philosophic chemistry, Theffe to Uffe the words at lead. The thoughts of an elegant writer appear like the moulder, ing hones of an ancient abbey, interspersed among the walls of foam more modern, but less durable frufleur. Boyle commences his preface by apologizing for letting his narrative make its appearance alone, as it is evidently a continuation of a larger discourse, but adds that it is an independent narrative, which, phase he, if I may fof peak, stands upon its own legs, without any need of depending upon anything that was delivered before, and therefore I think it no great venture, or incongruity, to let it come abroad by itself. He seems to imagine the gold to have suffered a still greater deterioration than is represented in the narrative, where it is spoken of as appearing like an imperfect metal. Only, yet to tell the truth, phase he, I think it was more embafed than foe. He then proceeds to the relation itself. Pyrophilus, by which name he usually meant himself, rives in a circle of virtuosi, and informs them that he is about to relate an experiment which may tend to persuade them of the possibility of transmutation, especially when added to the preceding discourse, which with Bayes we are to Fopov has passed in the green room, but adds that its result was not improving, but degrading gold. A certain Simplicius, who appears as a Thurfeats among thief chemical heroes, farts up with an objection that appears to be introduced, only that it may be answered by Ariftander. Pyrophilus, then, perceiving by fevral finds that be needed not to add anything of apologetical to what Ariftander had already fade to him, refumes his discourse, in which he labors to remove the objections that are wont to be framed against the possibility of metalline transmutation. From B2, the C4, the authority and prejudices of Aristotle, which he, however, adds, need not be fully diffused. The regularity of narration may here be interrupted to remark that however unnecessary fuk falum diffusflion may appear in the present era of philosophy, it was free, quaintly requified in the time of Boyle. He had many a noxious weed, grown rank with age, to remove from the field of science, before he could proceed in its cultivation, and tough who now are employed in rafing the pile, full look back with revengeful gratitude to him who removed the rubble from its base. The author, it may here be thought, like Pyrophilus M. this part of his speech, mufeft have had a caffion for a fort puff to take breath, and the reader is probably inclined like Boyle's Incredibus, to with that he would hasten to towards the historical part of his discourse. Pyrophilus proceeds to relate that meeting at the lodge, ings of one of his friends, with a stranger who had visited very remote oriental countries, he learned from him in the course of their conversation that the chemists of the Eoft, though more referved, were not less skillful than Tophet to Europe, in confirmation of which he presents Pyrophy, thus with a final piece of paper folded up, and takes his leave. Pyrophilus, who by no means regards this paper as containing a trife y, is scarcely consoled by it, for the lofts of this virtuosos company, which he much refensa. He, however, prepares to Uffe the fubtance contained in this paper, according to foam obscure directions which the travelled Fgevant had haftily given, and takes a witness or two, and as an affiftant, an experienced doctor of physic, very well versed in the separating and coupling of metals. For this caution he is much commended by Heliodorus, who, it appears afterwards, did worthily fufteen the dignity he had of pre-fighting in that choice company. Pyrophilus continues his narration, after professing it to be his opinion. That causufness is a very requisite qualification for Bim that would satisfactorily make curious experiments, and particularly in this WAF event, he thought would prove odd enough, and left his affiftant's perception fut be misled by previous information. Fo as to make him fancy, he really what he had been told he might expect, he resolves to obviate this prejudication as much as he innocently could, and only informs him that he expects a small proportion of powder presented him by a foreigner would render gold extremely brittle. He then opens the paper and finds in it a very small quantity of a dark red powder, which they estimate, without weighing, to avoid wafta at the 10th, or at mof the 8th part of a grain. They next weigh out in differing balances 2 drachms of cupelled and quarted gold, which they fuf in a new and well-annealed crucible on this gold. When fufed, the powder is projected and the fusion continued for a quarter of an hour, after which the gold is poured out into another annealed crucible, and fuffered to cool In the fire it had appeared like other fufed gold, except that for 2 or 3 moments the assistant observed that it looked like an opal, but when cold, though exactly of the same weight as before the fufion, instead of gold, was found a lump of metal of a dirty color, as it were overcapped with a thin coat, like half vitrified litharge, with a little globule of metal, not yellowish, but like coarse silver, and the bottom of the crucible was overlaid with a vitrified substance, whereof one part was of a transparent yellow, and the other of a deep brown inclining to red, and in this vitrified substance were plainly to be perceived febrile globules, more resembling silver than gold in their appearance. The larger piece of metal rubbed on the touchstone, and its mark, compared with toffe from a piece of gold and a piece of silver coin, it was found to be notoriously more like the touch of silver than that of gold. The lump being struck with a hammer was found brit, dull, and flew into febrile pieces, and the internal surface of toffe was of dirty color like that of brass or bell metal. 1 drachm of this degraded gold, being cupelled with about 6 times its weight of lead, required nearly double the usual time to complete the operation, which being ended, the cupel was found, smooth and entire, tinged with a fine purplifty red, and beside the refined gold there lay on the cavity of the cupel, foam dark-colored recrements, which were supposed to have proceeded not any gold in a certain heat. If there be a slight draught of air over its surface, will have this appearance, even silver and copper foam times prevent a limilar one. The color usually communicated by vitrified gold. From the lead, but from the deteriorated metal, in the refined gold, it was found deficient by feven grains. This deficiency was supplied by the above-mentioned Mercury, meant waff weight and fixity, notwithstanding their appearance of impurity, indicated their being gold. It was unfortunate that the fullness of them, and Pyrophilus and his afflictant's want of leisure, prevented this from being duly ascertained. That no doubt might remain refpetting the gold employed. A drachm and a half, intentionally referved out of the parcel of which the debuffed gold had been a portion, was melted by itself and found to be, as was expected, fine and well-colored gold. Pyrophilus confessals he did not try what effet aq Fortis would have on the debuffed gold, he not being provided with any wolf purity he could rely on. This, however, he was the less troubled at because he knew that gold, alloyed with silver or foam other metals, in certain portions, would protect them from the action of the nickel, Trau's acid. The metal specific gravity was found to be to that of water, only as, having been hydrostatically, EE4 weighed, it's 15 2/3 to 1. Brandt's experiments correlative to this are well known. The phenomena copyright beferved by Boyle and Brandt are similar to Thofi prevented by almost any alloy of metals requiring different solvents. This examine, by which he means not a form, but an examination, added to the other experiments, has justly great effects, laid on it by Pyrophilus Boyle, who observes that to hydrostatical trials B is not perhaps altogether a stranger. Specific gravity is above all other properties the least equivocal mark of identity or diversity in metallic bodies, and by what means soever we may conceive the powder to have acted on the gold in making it brittle, left splendid, or calcinable. We must allow this alteration in specific gravity to be by far the most wonderful effect of the projected powder. The objections of Dr. Lewis cannot be properly applied to this effect of the experiment, and fiercely to the others, for though gold may be rendered brittle by tin, or even by its vapor, as is fade, and its color altered by a small proportion of other matter, as is alpha fade, yet what? Known substance will alter considerably its specific gravity? It was on account of this circumstance, principally, that the prefect narrative was prefixed to a relation of experiments in which the specific gravity of a metallic substance was changed by a minute, proportion of a powder, and in a very small space of time. A change in this particular, in fixity, and in the capability of being calcined or vitrified, are the most certain marks of the conversion of a perfect into an imperfect metal, and the reverse of them of the contrary. The auditors of Pyrophilus appear to have paid great, in his notes on Neumann and elsewhere, attention, and to have received much pleasure from the recital of this notable circumstance superadded to the rest, for the generality of them and the precedent too, express themselves to be delighted as well as surprised by looking and smiling, after their murmuring is a little over. The worthy and eloquent precedent returns the thanks of the company to Pyrophilus, in a speech of which the reader will easily pardon the omission. This is followed by another from Cratipus, in which he demands why it would not be lawful for philosophers to prize fuch, a lump of depraved gold, before the finest gold the chimists are wont to afford us, and compares, or rather prefers, this lump to the metal's waff value is derived from their perpetuating foam conquest, as this deteriorated gold does the victory of art over nature. Pyrophilus, on being requested by the company to favor them with his reflections on the theory of his process, replies that he has only had foam-raving thoughts about this puzzling subject, and declines the talk. Heliodorus then urges him to draw foam inferences, and Foe to conclude. He then observes that in his experiment a change altogether as wonderful as that fade to be occasioned by the projection of the alchemists has really been produced. That gold, the most homogeneous and immutable of metals, may in a very short time be exceedingly changed in malleability, color, homogeneity, and in that which, as he justly observes, is beyond all, in specific gravity, and all this by only 1/1000th part of its weight of another substance. See, if Dix, if any credit be given, and purely the higeft is due, to Boyle, the author of the experiments on Mercury, which are next to be related, may hope to derive foam fansion from his authority, compared with Boyle's experiment the marvellous of his sphinx into the probable, nay more, if Boyle's experiment be credited, and who will refute his affent. Let it be remembered that it was made but once before 3 or 4 perfons at Mo 50. What then fall be fade to proceeds, often repeated, before numerous spectators? To conclude this abstract already too long dollar, let us deduce from it the following inference, which Hall be given in the words of Boyle, for whom the author, notwithstanding his having amused himself with the quaintness of his language, entertains the greatest veneration. The quotation has already been placed on the back of the inscription, as a more diffuse motto, but may be repeated here, as it cannot be too strongly impressed. We may, phase Boyle, among other things, learn from our experiment this Lafon, that we ought not to be full forward as many men other wife of great parts are wont to be, in preferring narrow limits to the power of nature and art, and in condemning and deriding all thuff that pretend to or believe uncommon things in chemistry, as either cheats or credulous. Experiments on Mercury and silver. Experiment I made May 6th, 1782. Before the Reverend Mr. Anderfon, Captain Francis Grofe, Mr. Ruffle, and Infine D. Grove, the gentleman mentioned in the introduction as the moft proper witness of the process, then resident in the town, half an ounce of mercury, provided by Captain Grove, bought at an apothecary's of the town, was placed in a small Hephian crucible, brought by Mr. Ruffle on a flux composed of borax, Alpho brought by him a small piece of charcoal. Taken out of a scuttle, fortuitio fly, by Mr. D. Gruff, and examined by the rest of the company, and a small piece of nitra alpho taken out without felection by the Reverend Mr. Anderfon, from a quantity in common uffe, in the laboratory, theffe being pounded together in a mortar which all the company had previously inspected, were pressed down into the crucible with a C2 small. Small peflin, this flux the mercury was poured by Mr. Anderfort, and upon it half a grain, carefully weighed out by Mr. Ruffle, of a certain powder of a deep red color furnished by Dr. P, was put on it by Mr. Anderfon. The crucible was then placed in a fire of a moderate red heat by Dr. P, who from his greater facility in managing the fire from long habit, was thought most eligible to conduct the experiment. He repeatedly called the attention of the company to observe the stages of the process, and to remark in every part of it that any voluntary decep on his part was impossible. In about a quarter of an hour, from the projection of the powder, and the placing the crucible in the fire, he observed to the company, who on inspection found his observation true, that the mercury, though in a red-hot crucible, hewed no signs of evaporation, or even of boiling. The fire was then gradually rafed, with attention on the part of the company, and repeated calls for that attention from Dr. P that no undue addition might be made to the matter in the crucible, in a strong glowing red, or rather white red, a small dip being taken on the point of a clean iron rod, and when cold, the forite foe taken and knocked off were hewn to the company and found replete with small globules of a wheateedy-colored metal, which Dr. P observed to them could not be mercury as being evidently fixed in that strong heat. But as he represented to them an intermediate substance between Q and a more perfect metal, a small quantity of borax, brought by Mr. R, was then injected by him and the fire rafed, but with the same precautions on the part of Dr. P to subject everything to the minute infection of the perfons prevent, and after continuing it in a strong red-white heat for about a quarter of an hour, the crucible was carefully taken out, gradually cooled on breaking it. A globule of yellow metal was found at bottom, and in the scoria smaller ones, which collected and placed in an accurate balance by Mr. Ruffle, were found to weigh fully 10 grains. This metal was in the preference of the above-mentioned gentleman sealed up in a phial, impressed with the seal of Mr. Anderfon, to be submitted to future examination, though everyone prefent was persuaded that the metal was gold. The field being broke the next morning, in the preference of the former company, and of Captain Often, and the metal hydrostatically examined. The weight of the larger globule, the others being too minute for this mode of examination, was found to be in air 9 grains and a quarter, and in distilled water of temp, Fahren, 50 plus, it loft, something more than, but not quite in half, of a grain. The difference was not appreciable, as no smaller weight than the eighth of a grain was at hand, but was judged by all the company to be nearly intermediate, i.e., half a grain. The F.P. G would be rather more than 18, 1, if only were loft in water. The F.P. Gr would exceed 24, 1. The intermediate would be 21, nearly, but as the lofts seemed rather more than the intermediate, though apparently and decided less than half a grain, the specific vidi muft have been nearly as 20, and in this ilimate all prevent quiv shech. After this hydrostatical examination, the globule was flattened by Percuflion into a thin plate, and examined by Mr. Rouflel in the manner of artifs for commercial purposes. On finifying his scrutiny, he declared it to be as good gold as the grain gold of the refiners, and that he would readily purchase gold as that which he had just examined at the higeft price demanded for the purest gold. The plate being then divided, one half was before the company filled up by Mr. A to be submitted to a trial of its purity, which Dr. P proposed, requesting his friend, Dr. Higgins, of Greek Street, to make, the remainder being put into AQ, regia, of nit, acid, and sal, ammon, afforded a solution sufficiently rich, before the company separated, to yield with full of tin, a richly colored crimson precipitate. R. Captain G was accidentally absent when the precipitate was made, but saw it next day. In about 4 hours, the portion of metal employed was completely deflawed, and the next morning before Captain and Mr. D. Grove and Mr. Rouflel, Mr. A being prevented from coming, the solution being divided into 3 portions the following X. Paraments were made, to the first portion, diluted with water, was added a quantity of caustic vol, ake, and the precipitate, which was copious, being duly separated and dried, about a grain of it, placed on a tin plate, was heated, and found to explode femartly. This experiment was repeated 3 times. To the second portion, diluted, was added a portion of sol, of tin in AQ, reg. A beautiful crimson-colored precipitate was immediately formed in considerable quantity, which when dried was mixed with a fusible frit, composed of flint powder, and the fluxes proper for the ruby glass of Capheus, in the proportion of 5 grains of the precipitate to zidge of the frit, and in a vitrifying heat afforded in about 3 hours a transparent glass, which by heating again assumed an elegant crimson color, and the remainder which continued in the fire alpho acquired a bright red color, the third portion being mixed with vitriolic ether, imparted to it the yellow color given to this fluid by solutions of gold, and the ether being evaporated in a fallow vessel, a thin purplish pellicle adhered to the fide, spotted in several places with yellow. Dr. Higgins Foon, after receiving the piece of metal, favored the author with an answer, in which he notified that the packet came to him under the proper feel, that he was well satisfied of the purity of the gold he received, and that he considered the author's experiments as exclusively sufficient to have ascertained the nature and purity of the metal. Experiment second, made at Dr. Price's, May 8, 1782, before Sir Philip, Clark, Dr. Spence, the Reverend Mr. Anderfon, Captain Grove, Mr. Rufelfell, and in fine Grove, half an ounce of mercury, procured from one Mr. Cunningham, an apothecary of the town, was placed on a flux composed of an ounce of powdered charcoal, 2 drachms of borax, and 1 scruple of nitre, and on it, when a little warmed, was projected 1 grain of a white powder, furnished by Dr. Price. After the crucible had acquired a red heat, the penny all fall the mercury lying quiet at the bottom, with, out boiling or smoking in the leaf, and it continued in this tranquil state after it had gained a full red heat. It was continued in a fire gradually augmented to a white heat, near 3/4 of an hour, a smaller crucible previously infefied being inverted on it to prevent coals from falling in, and the crucible being then withdrawn and cooled. Many globules of white metal were found diffused through the whole mass of coriae of the fey glow. Bules were collected to the weight of 10 grains, before the company separated, and confined to the care of Mr. Roof. Fell, who took them away with him, part of the remaining globules being afterwards collect. Ed, by pounding the crucible and wafting over the powder, the whole melted together amounted to 13 grains. Dr. Price remarked on this process that, having taken too great a quantity of charcoal, the globules were there, by differed over the whole mass, and the powder having been sprinkled against the sides of the crucible had not produced its great effect, and that foam of the mercury, which had escaped its action must have been volatilized by the heat, and this on inspection of the covering crucible was found to be true. The experiment was therefore the next morning repeated in preference of Mr. Anderfon, captain, and in fine Groff and Mr. Ruffle, experiment. Third, the remaining half-ounce of mercury was employed. The charcoal and borax, both taken without phyllation from large quantities in the laboratory, were powdered by NN, fine Groffet, and the mercury charged in the crucible as in the former experiment. Barely half a grain of the white powder, weighed out by Mr. Ruffle, was projected on the mercury, which by foam accidental delay had begun to boil in the crucible, but on the application of the powder, the ebullition ceased, although the crucible and contained mercury was subjected to a much greater heat, and it continued without boiling, even when of a red heat. The crucible was gradually heated to a white heat, and when cooled and broke, there was found in the bottom a well-colleted bead of fine white metal, weighing 4 grains. Experiment fourth. Oh, and the famed day, and the famed perfons being prefent, as at the preceding experiment, the following was made on silver. Mr. Rufflel weighed out 60 grains, 1 drachm, of grain silver, which he had purchased of Meffs, Weisfleuer, and C. Degrees, refiners in Love Lane, Wood Street. Cheap $5, this quantity was placed in a small crucible on foam of the flux made as above, before the company, by en fine Garoff, and on the silver, when in Foufion, was projected a bare half grain of the red powder, fed in experiment the first. The crucible was then replaced in the fire, and continued there for about a quarter of an hour. A piece of borax, taken at a venture, out of a jar containing a large quantity, was thrown on the metal by en fine Groffet. Dr. Price soon after, from the appearance of the flux, imagining the crucible to be cracked, by the cold and moisture of the borax, took it out of the fire, and, finding that what he fuff-peated had happened, did not replace it. When cool, it was broke, and the button of metal was found in the bottom, which, when weighed, appeared not to to have lost any of its original weight, FO, that fortunately only the flux had transfuted. Experiment fifth. That no doubt might arise from the failure of the crucible in the last experiment, a similar one was made in the preference of the famed perfons, with the addition of J.D. Garthwaite of EFQ, who was alpha prefent at the latter part of experiment 4. 30 grains of the above-mentioned grain silver was by Mr. Rufflel weighed out, and put into a small Heffleyan crucible, on a flux of charcoal and borax made before the company, with the famed precautions as an experiment. On the silver when foofed, was projected by Mr. Anderfon a bare half grain of the red powder, and about 5 minutes after, foam glass of borax, to avoid the moiflure contain. Ed in crude borax was thrown in by one of the company. The crucible, after being kept in a red-white heat for about 15 minutes, was taken out, and when cold broke, at bottom of the flux, which in this experiment was neatly fufed, lay the button of metal which was found nearly, if not exactly, of its original weight. It was then tried by Mr. Rufflel in the artificial's manner, as was alpha, the piece of metal obtained in experiment 4. He found both of them to contain gold of the latter in lar D2 G vinct jur quantity, as might be expected, from the relative proportion of the powder and silver in the 2 experiments. Dr. Price Alpho examined the metal on the touch of tion, Bephaltes, and with nitrous acid, when all the company saw the mark of gold remaining, while a mark from a piece of the very parcel of grain. Silver, from which the portion ufed in Thiefe experiments had been taken, and placed by the fide of the mark from the graduated or enriched silver, totally vanished on wetting it with the aqua fortis. The mark from the enriched silver remained, of a low color, after repeated affifusions of weak and strong aqua fortis, so that the company were entirely convinced. C.D. that gold was now contained in the foofed silver. The chemical reader will probably anticipate Dr. Price's observation, that of the known metallic substances of a gold-color sulphuretted tin could not without decomposition have sustained the heat employed in the fey experi. Ments, and that copper, or regulus of nickel, would have been diffelbelved by the nitrous acid, equally rith the silver. The remark is indeed scarce nefiarv, for had it been possible to have secretly introduced into the crucible any of the metals, and none of the company would for a moment tolerate the idea of fuch, an attempt having been made by the operator, the identity of weight observed was sufficient to prove that nothing but the crimphon powder had been added. After after the pieces of metal had been thus separately amined, they were melted together, and when cool, it was remarked that the surface of the Kulov metal was gantly radiated with alternate arise and furrows, and AP, parents not fuel in fufed silver. 10 grains were referred by Dr. P for his own examination, and the other 80 grains were taken by Mr. Ruffle to be allayed in the refiner's manner. Dr. P found the proportion of gold to be F of the whole maths. Mr. Ruffle, in the course of a few days, coughed all the above-mentioned gold, silver, and mixture of gold and silver, to be a fade in the artifice manner, for the refiners at the office of Mefsar Esprat and Dean, Fay Mafters, near Cheapfide. They affayed each portion separately, and reported the gold and silver to be of the molt complete purity, and the enriched silver to contain gold in the proportion of 1/8 of the joint weight. And this report he alpha repeated before the spectators of Experim. 7th, on May 25th, it was remarkable that both the refiner and a flay mafti CR at Firgi affirmed the impossibility of fuchefs in the process, and prejudiced by received opinions, questioned the purity of the metals, though they owned they looked much like ordinary gold. The affay instantly dissipated their doubts, and they owned, with aftenifament, that the metals were entirely entirely pure, and certified their purity in their official report. Experiment 6th, made May 15th, 1782, before Sir Philip Norton Clarke. The Reverend B. Anderfon, Captain Grofe, Dr. Spence, Infine Grofe, and Mr. Hallenby, and feveral times repeat. Ed. Before Mr. Anderfon, Dr. Spence, and Infine Grofe. 2 ounces of mercury were, by one of the Pani, taken out of a cistern in the laboratory, containing about 200 weight of quicksilver, for experiments on the gaffs, and in a small Wedgwood's ware mortar rubbed with a drop or 2 of ether. On this Mercury, which was very bright and remarkably fluid, barely a grain of the white powder, was put, and afterwards rubbed up with it for about 3 minutes. On pouring the section out of the mortar, it was observed to have become blackif, and to pour flugifully, after standing 10 minutes, on being poured out of the vessel in which it had flood, it was found considerably less fluid than before one, and in a quarter of an hour's time, FO increased in piflitude as hardly to pour at all, but seemed full of lumps. Being now trained through a cloth, a fubflance like an amalgam, of a pretty solid confidence, remained behind, the unfixed mercury being expelled from this MAFs, by placing it on charcoal and directing the flame of a lamp on it with a blowpipe. A bead of fine white metal remained fixed in a strong red heat, which by every subsequent trial appeared to be silver, the weight of the bead thus collected, weighed, and examined before the company. Separated was I 3 grains, but much remain. Ing in the trained mercury, this was afterwards separat. Ed and weighed 11 grains, the whole obtained was there, 429 grains, or an increase in proportion to the powder as 28, 1. 5 drachms of mercury, taken out in the same manner as the above 2 ounces, were rubbed up with ether, and afterwards with barely a quarter of a grain of the red powder JMFs like an amalgam, being obtained by, training it after it had, took about a quarter of an hour, and the unfixed and untinged mercury driven off before the blow pipe. As in the former experiment, a bead of yellow metal remained, weighing 4 grains, 3, and after, landing foam time longer, GR2 and F more were obtained, both which fitted aquafortis on the touchstone, and a small quan. Titty being devolved in aqua regia, a purple precipitate was produced from the soul, by the soul, of tin, and a brown F1 by soul. Feri vitriolati, Bergam, green vitriol oi. 1C oper as J. In this experiment, therefore, the increase of gold was to the powder employed as 24-1, exclusive of the weight of the powder. The former part of this experiment was repeated on Saturday, the 18th day of May, before the Reverend Mr. Manning, the Reverend Mr. Fulham, the Reverend Mr. Anderfon, the Reverend Mr. Robinson, and Dr. Spence. 2 ounces of mercury, treated as before mentioned, after exhibiting phenomena similar to those above related, afforded a mass, 1/2 of which only, to avoid the noxious mercurial fumes of the whole, after having the mercury expelled from it by a white heat before the blowpipe, yielded upwards of 12 grains of a white metal, that in every trial to which it was submitted, appeared to be silver. The produce, FT therefore, including the silver contained in the trained mercury, would have been nearly as 28, as in the former experiment. A small portion, about size, of the above mercury being put into another vessel, and about the fixth of a grain of the red powder put on it, the mercury, after being ground up with it, and standing foam time, was framed as the 4 mare, and the small mafsfo obtained, placed before the blowpipe. It yielded something more than a grain of metal, which examined by nit. Acid on the touchstone evidently contained gold, as was apparent to the company before their leaving the laboratory. It was intended to have been submitted to other trials, but from its minutenefs and form, was accidentally loft. Vingt sink. Experiment. 7th. Made Saturday, May 25th, 1782. In the presence of the Lords Onflow, King and Palmerston, Sir Robert Barker, Sir Philip and Clarke, Bart 8, the Reverend O. Manning, B. Anderfon, G. Pollen, J. Robinson, C. L. Kess, Dr. Spence, W. M. Man Gottschall, W. M. Smith, W. Gottschall, Jun R. E. F. Cuars, Mefsar S. Gregory, and Ruflel. Gege mercury were taken from the cistern formerly men, shindy, and in a similar manner, and rubbed up with a few drops of ether, in the Lamal mortar, as in Experiment 6. A bare grain of the white powder was projected, and afterwards rubbed up with it. The section, which before the addition of the powder had been very bright and fluid, was now perceived by the company to be dull and run hier. Villi. It was poured out into a small glass vessel, and after handing for about 45 minutes was put into a cloth to be trained. It now poured full flugifully that the latter portions of it feamed in a height intermediate between fluidity and fluidity, or to use a term less scientific, but like many other vulgar ones, very descriptive, poured grouty. Great part of the superfluous mercury being trained off, a mass similar to an amalgam was left in the cloth, and the remaining mercury, which could not be pruffled out, being driven off by fire. From a portion, about a fourth of the whole mass, a globule of white metal which had all the appearance of silver, remained, and was kept in a white heat for about 2 minutes, before the blowpipe. This globule weighed about 10 grains, FO that the whole duct, by means of 1 grain, would have been found if collected to be 40 grains besides what was left in the expressed mercury. On the famed day, and before the famed respectable company, half an ounce of mercury revivified from cinnabar, brought by the Reverend Mr. Anderfon, was by him placed in a small round English crucible, taken from among a number of others in the laboratory by Lord Palmerston, on a flux composed of a small piece of charcoal and a piece of borax, both taken carefully by foam of the company from large quantities, and pounded in a mortar previously infected by thulf prevent. This flux being pressed down in the crucible with a small pestle, Alpha examined, the mercury was poured into the deprephian by one of the spectators, and on it half a grain, bare weight of the red powder, was put by Lord Palmerston. The crucible being then covered with a lid taken in the same manner as the crucible from among many others, and hewn round to the company, was placed in the furnace, surrounded by lighted charcoal. One or more of the company, particularly the Lords King and Palmerston, were during the whole time of the experiment clothed to the furnace and operator, and as requested by him gave the clothed attention to every part of the process. When the crucible had acquired a full red heat, the cover was removed, and feveril of the company saw the mercury in a tranquil state, neither evaporating nor boiling, in which state it continued, even when the mercury itself was completely ignited. The vincept. The cover being replaced, the fire was gradually raised to a white heat. The crucible being continued in this heat for 30 minutes, was taken out, cooled, and broke. A globule of metal was found at bottom, neatly fused, and exhibly fitting the concavity of the divided fourier. This globule fell out by the blow, among the fragments of the crucible, and was taken up and hewn round to the penny by Lord Palmerston, and in their preference replaced in the hollow of the vitrified borax, to which it was AC, curately adapted. Many other globules were diffused through the scoriae attached to the sides of the crucible, fragments of which were distributed among the company at their request. The bead, which lay at the bottom, weighed about 10 grains, and was taken away, together with the silver, by Mr. Godfall, and by him afterwards transmitted to Lord Palmerston, to be submitted to proper examination. Mr. Godfall returned the gold, with the Afay Mafter's report on it and on the silver. The Afay Mafter, whom Mr. G, for greater certainty on this occasion, had the precaution to have recommended by the clerk of the Goldsmiths' Company, reported both the gold and silver to be perfectly pure. Dr. Price, though well acquainted with the characters employed by Afay Mafters in making their reports the 5 which are peculiar to them, unwilling to rely entirely on his own knowledge, and being desirous to offer collateral evidence to the public, viewed the gold and the report to Mr. Locke, an experienced goldsmith and a magistrate of the city of Oxford, without informing him of any of the above party. Cullers, Mr. Vinct Hewitt. Mr. Locke, before 2 gentlemen of Magdalen Hall who were present, affirmed the metal to be by the report pure gold, which he added was confirmed by its appearance, and that it consequently was superior to gold of the English standard. 2 experiments, similar to those made on Saturday, May 2005, were repeated on a larger scale, before foam of the above company on the Tuesday following, with the same attention on their part, and more on that of the doctor to the regulation of the fire, which he observed to them, being now less engaged, and his attention not divided, he could employ to produce a much greater effect. 12 grains of the white powder produced from 30 ounces of mercury upwards of 1 ounce and a quarter, or 600 grains of fixed white metal, or in the proportion of 50:1, and 2 grains of the red powder produced from 1 ounce of mercury, 2 drachms, or 120 grains of fixed and tinged metal, i.e., 60 times its own weight. The left portions of gold and silver, as well as a part of the produce of the former experiment, have had the honor of being submitted to the inspection of His Majesty, who is pleased to express his royal approbation. This honor may be mentioned with the less impropriety, as it is conferred by a sovereign equally revered for his patronage of science and beloved for his amiable condescension. Do the N.D.